Welcome to the second episode of the Literary Therapeutic Special Series, Season 1. A literary therapeutic exploration of Gustave Le Bon's work, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind from 1895. This series explores the psychology of the crowd, not as a historical theory, but as a living pattern of our present moment. Gustave Le Bon describes the crowd as a being of its own kind, emotional, impulsive, suggestible, regressive, a collective that reshapes the individual and drives them toward actions they would never commit alone. In episode 1, we saw how the crowd emerges and why it possesses a force stronger than the sum of its members. We understood that the crowd is not merely an assembly of many people, but a psychological phenomenon with its own inner dynamics. In this second episode, we go deeper. We explore the soul of the crowd, that state in which the individual loses contour, the personal voice softens, and inner order yields to collective feeling. Le Bon writes, "The crowd possesses a soul of its own, which reshapes the individual." We ask, when do I lose my own voice in groups? Which emotions dominate me in collective situations? Which role do I typically take on in groups? Where do I feel regression? This episode is not a moral commentary. It is a clear, critical examination of a physical mechanism that touches all of us. Before we enter the theory, we step into a moment in which the collective soul becomes perceptible. Overview of this episode. This episode examines the dynamics of the crowd from two directions, from the outside as a collective phenomenon and from the inside as a psychological state. It follows a clear dramaturgical arc that moves from the inner scene toward conceptual consolidation. Key themes. The inner scene as a starting point of collective mood. The emergence of the collective soul. Mechanisms such as emotional contagion, simplification, regression, and suggestibility. The fading of the I in the permeability of the individual. The return to one's own voice as a psychological counter-movement. The integration of outer dynamics and inner response. A meditation to restore inner contour. A recapitulation of the central concepts of this episode. For those who prefer to read along or need an initial sense of tone and structure, the transcript of the audio episode, for example on YouTube, can be manually activated. It supports not only people with hearing impairments or language learners, but also those who absorb complex material more easily when listening and reading simultaneously. This read-aloud script builds on the transcript and expands it with a full dramaturgical structure, additional reflection prompts, and a deeper conceptual elaboration. Chapter 1. Inner Scene. The moment of losing oneself. You stand in a room that could be familiar to you. A living room, a seminar space, an office. A place where people gather without anything remarkable happening. Voices fill the air, not loud, not aggressive, but like a soft background hum that slowly settles into the body. You hear fragments of conversation, laughter, The clinking of a glass, the rustling of clothing. It is an ordinary moment, one of many you encounter throughout a lifetime. And yet something begins, something that will only reveal its significance later. At first, it is only a feeling, a barely perceptible pull, a faint tug at your attention. You notice your body tensing ever so slightly, how you shift your posture without thinking, how you turn a little more toward the group. It is not a conscious decision. It is a reflex, an impulse of adaptation rooted deep within the social nervous system. A sentence is spoken, casually, perhaps a comment about someone who is not present. Laughter follows, a nod of agreement, a glance that brushes past you to check whether you are joining in. You feel yourself reacting inwardly, perhaps a brief hesitation, a moment of waiting. You are not entirely sure whether you agree, but you know that the group does. And in that knowledge lies a force stronger than your conviction. You smile, a small, polite, unobtrusive smile. It is not false, but it is not entirely yours either. It is a smile that adapts, that blends in, that avoids disruption. The conversations continue, and you notice yourself drifting within them, not completely, but enough to sense that something in you is yielding. You say something you would not have said on your own. You laugh at a moment you would not have laughed alone. You nod, even though you feel uncertain inside. It is not a betrayal of yourself, not a dramatic rupture. It is a quiet, almost tender process of disappearing, a soft retreat of your own contour in favor of a collective rhythm. Perhaps you feel a flicker of irritation, a brief flare of awareness. Why am I doing this? But the thought is fleeting. It does not have the strength to stand against the group's dynamic. The group is warm, lively, inviting. It offers belonging, and belonging is a powerful feeling. It offers orientation, and orientation is a need. It offers safety, and safety is a promise that is difficult to ignore. You notice your voice changing. It becomes softer or harder, depending on what the group demands. It becomes faster or slower, louder or quieter. It adapts, not because you want it to, but because it is easier, because it creates less friction, because it carries less risk. The group shapes you without you noticing. It writes itself into your gestures, your expressions, your words. And then a moment of clarity, a brief, sharp thought. This is not entirely me. It is not loud, not dramatic, not rebellious. It is sober, an observation, a statement, a sign that something in you is still awake, still seeing, still sensing. But the thought stands alone. It has no allies in the moment. The group is stronger. The collective mood is denser. The dynamic is faster. You breathe in, you breathe out. You remain standing. And you know, something else is speaking through me. The moment of losing yourself lingers in the body for a breath, like an after echo. Something in you knows that this quiet process was not accidental, but part of a larger pattern. To understand what has happened within you, we must step back and look at how a crowd can become a psychological being in the first place. Chapter 2: The Emergence of a Collective Soul. The moment of losing oneself from the previous chapter lingers in the body like an after echo. Something in you knows that this quiet process was not accidental, but part of a larger pattern. To understand what has folded within you, we must take a step back and consider how a crowd can become a psychological being in the first place. Le Bon begins with a thesis that remains provocative to this day. The crowd is always intellectually below the level of the individual, yet it possesses a soul of its own. He does not mean a mystical entity, but a state in which people begin to feel alike, react alike, and judge alike. The crowd becomes a psychological organism that reshapes its members. A collective soul does not arise from the number of people present, but from the synchronization of their inner states. It is a process that unfolds quietly, often unnoticed, yet with immense impact. Le Bon describes several mechanisms that make this state possible. The first is anonymity. As soon as people experience themselves as part of something larger, they lose the sense of being visible as individuals. Responsibility disperses. Consequences seem smaller. Inhibitions sink. Anonymity is not a shield. It is a catalyst. The second mechanism is emotional contagion. Feelings travel faster than thoughts. A laugh, a frown, a tone of voice. All of it acts like a spark moving from body to body. Le Bon writes, "The crowd feels before it thinks." And in this lies its power. Emotions are immediate. They require no arguments, no explanations, no logic. They act directly. The third mechanism is shared arousal. This may be a common topic, a common opponent, a common goal. But it can also be something much smaller, a shared irritation, a shared joke, a shared moment of uncertainty. This arousal creates an emotional field in which people begin to mirror one another. The fourth mechanism is the loss of personal consequences. Within the crowd, the individual feels less responsible for what they do or say. The action becomes a collective action. Responsibility becomes collective responsibility. The I recedes, the we steps forward. And finally, there is belonging, a deep human need, stronger than many convictions. Belonging offers safety, orientation, warmth. It is a psychological promise that is difficult to ignore. The crowd offers belonging with an intensity the individual rarely experiences alone. Together, these mechanisms create a kind of psychological climate, a space in which people begin to think, speak, and act in similar ways. The collective soul is not a metaphysical concept, but an emotional pattern expressed through bodies, voices, and glances. You can see it in large gatherings, but also in small rooms, in families, in teams, in spiritual groups, in digital communities. Wherever people emotionally synchronize, a form of collective identity emerges that can be stronger than the individual one. Le Bon observes that the crowd acts below the level of the individual. The phrasing is provocative, but psychological understandable. The crowd prefers simple feelings, clear images, quick judgments. It has no patience for ambivalence, no time for differentiation, no appetite for complexity. This does not mean the crowd is irrational. It follows a different logic, the logic of emotional efficiency. Modern examples show how timeless Le Bon's observations are. In social media, collective moods arise within minutes. In families, role patterns can be passed down for generations without conscious choice. In spiritual groups, a shared tone often emerges that feels like truth. In political movements, complexity is reduced in favor of clear enemy images. The collective soul is therefore not a phenomenon of the masses in the classical sense, but a psychological pattern that emerges wherever people emotionally synchronize. The crucial point is, the collective soul is not neutral. It pulls, it shapes, it influences. It can connect, but it can also consume. Reflection prompt. When was the last time I felt that a mood was stronger than my own conviction? With this understanding of the collective soul, we can now look more closely at what triggers within the individual. For as soon as the crowd emerges, a second process begins: the loss of the self. Chapter 3: The loss of the self. The view of the collective soul shows how people become emotionally synchronized. But this describes only half of the process. The other half concerns what happens within the individual once they become part of this collective dynamic. Le Bon calls this process the loss of conscious personality, a term that sounds dramatic, yet in reality often begins quietly, as quietly as the moment described in Chapter 1. Le Bon writes, "The individual in the crowd loses his conscious personality. His feelings and thoughts are directed by the crowd. He does not mean that the person ceases to exist, but that they recede into the background. The self is not erased, but it becomes overlaid. It loses sharpness, contour, and resistance." The first mechanism of this loss is anonymity, As soon as people experience themselves as part of something larger, their inner balance shifts. Responsibility disperses. Consequences seem smaller. Inhibitions sink. Anonymity is not only a shield, it is a psychological amplifier. It allows individuals to do or say things they would never do alone, not necessarily out of malice, but out of a sense of relief. The second mechanism is diffusion of responsibility. In the crowd, no one feels solely responsible. The action becomes a collective action. Responsibility becomes collective responsibility. The I steps back, the we steps forward. This process is subtle but powerful. It explains why people in groups can become bolder, more aggressive, or more impulsive than they would be alone. The third mechanism is an emotional contagion. Feelings travel faster than thoughts. A laugh, a frown, an indignant exclamation. All of it acts like a spark moving from body to body. Le Bon describes this as an immediate transmission, a kind of psychological echo that intensifies within a crowd. The individual feels what others feel, often before knowing why. These three mechanisms lead to a state Le Bon calls psychic regression. Regression does not mean moral decline, but a return to simpler, more impulsive patterns. The person becomes more childlike, more emotional, more dependent. They see clear answers, clear belonging, clear orientation. The self becomes softer, more malleable, more permeable. Modern examples show how everyday this process is. At family gatherings, one adapts to a tone that has existed for years, even if one does not share it. In teams, one absorbs moods one would not have alone. Stress, euphoria, mistrust. In political groups, one becomes radical more quickly because the group amplifies emotions. On social media, one reacts more impulsively because the collective mood overlays personal perception. The loss of the self is not a failure. It is a human mechanism deeply rooted in the social nervous system. It shows how dependent we are on resonance and how quickly resonance becomes adaptation. But this process has a shadow side. When the self becomes quieter, the crowd becomes louder. When one's own voice recedes, the collective voice gains power. When personal perception blurs, the collective perception becomes truth. Reflection prompt. Which feelings dominate me when I am part of a group, and which of them truly belong to me? As the self becomes quieter, space opens for a second phenomenon that Le Bon describes as particularly dangerous: regression, a turn to simpler, more impulsive patterns that shape the crowd even more strongly. Chapter 4: Regression, the return to simplicity. When the self becomes quieter, a space opens, a space that something else begins to fill. Le Bon calls this something regression, a term often misunderstood in psychology. He does not mean moral decline, but a return to simpler, psychological patterns that are activated within the crowd. It is a state in which the human being becomes more impulsive, more emotional, more dependent. A state that strengthens the crowd and weakens the individual. Le Bon writes, "The crowd thinks in images, not in concepts." This sentence is central. It describes a shift from complex thinking to imagistic thinking, from differentiation to simplification, from ambivalence to clarity. The crowd prefers clear forms, clear feelings, clear judgments, not because it is unintelligent, but because it follows a different psychological principle: emotional efficiency. Regression means that the individual in the crowd falls back on patterns older than their conscious personality. Patterns formed in childhood. The need for belonging, for guidance, for clarity, for safety. These patterns are not wrong. They are human, but they are vulnerable to manipulation when they remain unconscious. A central element of regression is simplification. Complex situations are reduced to simple images. Ambivalent feelings are translated into clear categories: good or bad, right or wrong, us or them. This simplification is psychologically relieving. It reduces inattention. It creates orientation, but it distorts reality. Another element is emotionalization. Feelings become stronger, more immediate, less reflected. The crowd does not know subtle feelings. It knows only strong ones. Le Bon writes, "The crowd is always exaggerated." This means it amplifies what is already present. A small irritation becomes indignation. A mild sympathy becomes enthusiasm. A diffuse fear becomes panic. The crowd is an amplifier. Regression also appears in the search for leadership. The individual in the crowd seeks someone who tells them what to do, not out of weakness, but out of the need for orientation. Leadership offers safety. It reduces uncertainty. It creates structure. But it can also be misused when it is not reflected. Another characteristic is dependence. The individual in the crowd becomes more dependent on the mood, the opinion, the dynamic of the group. They orient themselves more toward external signals than toward internal convictions. Their perception becomes colored by the emotional climate of the group. Their judgments are influenced by the group's synchronization. Modern examples show how everyday regression is. On social media, complex topics are reduced to simple narratives. In spiritual groups, clear truths emerge that are not questioned. In political movements, enemy images are created that offer orientation. In families, roles are reproduced that are long outdated. In teams, groupthink arises that silences critical voices. Regression is not an exceptional state. It is an everyday psychological mechanism that emerges wherever people emotionally synchronize. It is not dangerous as long as it remains conscious. It becomes dangerous only when it acts unnoticed. The crucial point is, regression is not the opposite of reason. It is another mode. A mode that is faster, more emotional, more immediate. A mode that strengthens the crowd and weakens the individual. A mode that offers orientation but makes differentiation more difficult. Reflection prompt. Where do I feel the tendency to think more simply in groups than I would on my own? From this regression emerges a second movement that Le Bon describes as particularly formative: the emotional dominance of the crowd. To understand how this dominance arises and why it is so powerful, we now turn to the next step. Chapter 5: The emotional dominance of the crowd. Out of regression emerges a state that decisively shapes the dynamics of the crowd: emotional dominance. Le Bon describes this state as a psychological field stronger than individual perception, stronger than personal conviction, stronger even than conscious decision. The crowd begins to feel, and the individual feels with it. Le Bon writes, "The crowd feels before it thinks." This sentence is central. It marks the shift from inner orientation to outer atmosphere. Emotional dominance means that feelings no longer arise from within, but from the emotional climate created by the group. This climate is not neutral. It pulls, it pushes, it colors. It acts like a current that carries the individual along, even when they believe they are standing still. The first mechanism of this dominance is amplification. Feelings that arise within the crowd become more intense. A small irritation becomes indignation. A mild sympathy becomes enthusiasm. A diffuse unease becomes fear. The crowd amplifies what is already present, and it does so faster than the individual can reflect. The second mechanism is synchronization. People begin to align emotionally with one another, not consciously, not intentionally, but through a kind of inner echo. A glance, a tone of voice, a breath. All of it is enough to transmit the mood. The crowd feels together, and this shared feeling creates a force greater than the sum of its parts. The third mechanism is simplification. Emotional dominance does not tolerate ambivalence. It demands clear feelings, clear judgments, clear belongings. Complex inner states are reduced, differentiated perceptions smoothed out. The crowd prefers clarity, not because it is rational, but because it is emotionally efficient. The fourth mechanism is suggestibility. In an emotionally charged climate, the individual becomes more receptive to external impulses. Words strike deeper. Images resonate more strongly. Moods act more immediately. Suggestibility does not mean naivety. It means that inner resistance is weakened, not by persuasion, but by emotional overwhelm. Modern examples show how everyday emotional dominance is. On social media, moods flip within minutes, from excitement to outrage, from outrage to panic. In teams, stress spreads faster than any factual information. In spiritual groups, a shared tone emerges that feels like truth. In political movements, Feelings become points of orientation, while arguments fade. Emotional dominance is not an exceptional state. It is an everyday psychological mechanism that emerges wherever people emotionally synchronize. It is not dangerous as long as it remains conscious. It becomes dangerous only when it acts unnoticed, when it overlays perception before the individual realizes it is happening. The crucial point is, emotional dominance does not replace one's own perception. It covers it. It does not erase the self. It makes it quieter. It creates belonging, but at the cost of differentiation. Reflection prompt. When was the last time I felt a feeling grow stronger in me because the group felt it, not because I felt it? Where the crowd becomes loud, a quieter counter movement begins. The return to one's own voice. How this return unfolds and how the individual regains their inner contour becomes visible in the next chapter. Chapter 6. The return to one's own voice. The emotional dominance of the crowd creates a state in which the individual can barely hear themselves. One's own voice becomes quieter, the collective voice louder. Yet Le Bon emphasizes that the human being does not dissolve entirely into the crowd. Something remains. Something that does not disappear, but is merely overlaid. This something is the inner voice, the inner contour that does not vanish, but steps back. The question is, how does it return? Le Bon writes, only the individual possesses reason. The crowd possesses only feeling. This sentence is not meant morally. It describes a psychological distinction. The crowd operates emotionally, while the individual can reflect. The return to one's own voice is therefore not a heroic act, but a psychological process that begins the moment the individual reconnects with their own perception. The first step in this return is perception, the moment in which one senses something is not quite right. Something in me has become quieter. This perception is often fleeting, barely tangible, yet it is the beginning. It shows that the inner voice is still present, even if it has been overlaid. Perception is not resistance. It is awakening. The second step is distancing, not in the sense of withdrawal or separation, but as an inner step back, a minimal distance between oneself and the collective mood. This distance does not need to be large. One breath is enough. One thought. One brief moment of clarity. Distancing means I see that I'm part of a dynamic, and I recognize it as dynamic. The third step is reorientation, the rediscovery of one's own inner line. This may be a value, a conviction, a feeling, a thought. Something that has not come from the crowd, but from within. Reorientation does not mean standing against the crowd. It means standing with oneself. It is a return to one's own perspective. The fourth step is responsibility. The recognition that one's own voice carries weight, even when it is quiet. Responsibility means taking one's own perception seriously, even when the collective mood demands something else. It means allowing one's own differentiation, even when the crowd demands clarity. Modern examples show how this return can appear. In a heated discussion, one suddenly notices saying something one does not truly mean and corrects oneself. In a group escalating into outrage, one realizes they are not outraged and remains calm. In a team spiraling into stress, one senses the work differently and holds to their own structure. In spiritual group proclaiming absolute truth, one notices doubt and allows it. The return to one's own voice is not a heroic act. It is an inner process that begins quietly and stabilizes slowly. It is a psychological movement that requires courage, not outwardly, but inwardly. Courage to take one's own perception seriously. Courage to allow one's own differentiation. Courage to feel one's own contour again. The crucial point is, the crowd can overlay the self, but cannot erase it. The inner voice can become quieter, but it does not disappear. It waits for the moment in which it can be heard again. Reflection prompt. What do I need in order to stay with myself in groups? And how do I recognize the moment when my own voice becomes quieter? With this, the circle closes back to the first episode. After seeing how the crowd emerges and how it transforms the individual, we now turn to the question of how these two movements belong together and what they reveal about the dynamic between outer and inner worlds. Chapter 7: Integration, from Episode 1 to Episode 2. The return to one's own voice marks an inner turning point. It shows that the human being does not dissolve entirely into the crowd, but that something remains, something that can withdraw from the collective dynamic. This closes the circle back to the first episode. For while Episode 1 described the outer movement, the emergence of the crowd, its structure, its dynamics, Episode 2 has revealed the inner movement. What happens within the individual once they become part of this collective force? Integration means bringing these two movements together. It means recognizing that the crowd is not only an external phenomenon, but an internal one. That it does not exist only in stadiums, demonstrations, or digital spaces, but also in families, teams, circles of friends, spiritual groups, and within ourselves. The crowd is not a place. It is a psychological state. Le Bon describes the crowd as being of its own kind, arising the moment people set aside their individuality in favor of a collective feeling. Episode 1 showed how this collective soul emerges through anonymity, emotional contagion, shared arousal, diffusion of responsibility, belonging, and the formation of an emotional climate. Episode 2 has shown how this collective soul acts upon the individual through regression, emotional dominance, simplification, suggestibility, synchronization, and the loss of the self. Integration means viewing these two perspectives not as separate, but as two sides of the same process. The crowd does not arise only on the outside. It arises on the inside. And the transformation of the inner world is not merely a consequence. It is a part of the crowd itself. The crowd is an interplay between outer dynamics and inner response. A central idea of this integration is porosity. The human being is porous to moods, atmospheres, collective impulses. This porosity is not a weakness. It is a fundamental human trait. It enables empathy, resonance, community. But it also makes us vulnerable to overlaying, to simplification, to emotional dominance. Porosity is ambivalent. Another idea is ambivalence. The crowd is not only destructive. It can connect, stabilize, motivate. It can offer orientation, create belonging, release energy, but it can also distort, radicalize, exaggerate. The crowd is neither good nor bad. It is a psychological phenomenon that must be understood. Integration also means recognizing personal responsibility, not in a moral sense, but in a psychological one. The crowd does not remove responsibility. It shifts it. It makes responsibility more diffuse, but not irrelevant. The turn to one's own voice is therefore not only an individual act, but an integral part of the dynamic between individual and crowd. Modern examples show how this integration appears. In digital spaces, the crowd forms within seconds, and the individual must learn to find their own voice with this speed. In political movements, energy arises, and the individual must learn to distinguish between enthusiasm and exaggeration. In spiritual groups, belonging emerges, and the individual must learn to differentiate between resonance and regression. In teams, synchronization develops, and the individual must learn to maintain their own structure. Integration means not fearing the crowd, but understanding it. Not idealizing it, but recognizing it. Not fighting it, but moving through it consciously. The crowd is part of human life. The question is not whether we can escape it, but how we move within it. Reflection prompt. How does my perception of the crowd change when I view it not as an external threat, but as an internal state? To not only understand this integration, but to feel it, the following meditation leads back to one's own contour, to the place where the crowd ends and the individual begins. Chapter 8. Meditation. The Inner Contour. Sit down, breathe in and out. Let the body arrive without changing anything. Just sitting, just breathing, just being here. Imagine a group, not concrete, only as a form, a gathering of voices, movements, expectations, a space in which many people breathe at the same time. Feel how this group acts upon you, not as a threat, not as a promise, simply as a presence. Perhaps it pulls you in. Perhaps it presses on you. Perhaps it calms you. Perhaps it challenges you. Notice it without judging it. Now take an inner step back, just one. Not away, just back. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Feel the weight of your body. Feel the line of your spine. Feel the breath moving in and out. Say inwardly, I am here. Not against the group, not above the group, not outside the group, but with yourself. Let the voices of others become quieter, not silent, just quieter, like a background sound that no longer dominates. Feel your own voice, not as sound, as contour, as a line running through you. Perhaps it is quiet. Perhaps it is clear. Perhaps it is only a feeling. Notice without shaping it. Breathe in and out. Imagine standing in the midst of the group, people moving, the mood shifting, the atmosphere vibrating, and you stand there, not separated, not dissolved, porous but not lost. Feel the boundary between you and the group, not as a wall, as a fine line, a line you do not defend. You perceive it. Breathe in and out. Say inwardly, this is me. Not loudly, not forcefully, just clearly. Remain there for a moment, in this line, in this counter, in this voice. Then slowly open up your eyes. The group remains where it is, and you remain where you are. The meditation has made the inner counter perceptible again, that point where the crowd ends and the individual begins. but every inner movement needs conceptual clarity to anchor itself. The following pages summarize the central terms of this episode. They form the cognitive structure of what was previously experienced, emotionally, atmospherically, and scenically. Chapter 9: Recapitulation. Key concepts of this episode. This episode has made the dynamics of the crowd visible from two perspectives: an outer phenomenon and an inner state. The following terms form the conceptual structure of this episode. They are not definitions, but points of orientation. Words that precisely name the psychological movements explored here. Collective soul. The state of emotional synchronization in which people begin to feel, react, and judge in similar ways. A psychological pattern that emerges wherever people attune to one another. Anonymity. The amplifier that lowers inhibitions and reduces the sense of personal visibility. It relieves, but it also distorts responsibility. Emotional contagion. Feelings travel faster than thoughts. A glance, a tone of voice, a laugh is enough to shift inner states. The crowd feels before it thinks. Diffusion of responsibility. The dissolution of individual responsibility within the group. The I steps back, the we steps forward. Responsibility is not removed, it is distributed. Shared arousal. A shared focus or impulse that creates an emotional field and intensifies moods. This field acts like a resonance chamber. Belonging. A deep human need that offers orientation and safety, but also carries the risk of losing one's own voice. Emotional climate. The invisible field that emerges when people emotionally synchronize. It shapes perception and behavior more strongly than arguments. Synchronization. The process by which people unconsciously align with one another in posture, tone, opinion, mood. A quiet but powerful process. Emotional efficiency. The logic of the crowd. It prefers simple feelings, clear images, quick judgments. Not out of ignorance, but out of psychological economy. Regression. The return to simpler, more impulsive patterns. The person becomes childlike, more emotional, more dependent. Regression is not a backward step. It is a mode. Simplification. Complex situations are reduced to clear images. Ambivalence becomes unbearable. Differentiation feels like a disturbance. Suggestibility. Heightened receptivity to external impulses. The crowd responds more strongly to images, symbols, voices, gestures. It follows atmospheres, not arguments. Emotional dominance. The crowd knows only strong, simple feelings. Nuance disappears. Ambivalence is suppressed. Emotions become the inner logic of the group. Loss of the self. The contour of the individual becomes softer, more permeable. The collective voice grows louder. The self steps back, but it does not disappear. Porosity. The human capacity to absorb moods. It enables empathy, but makes one vulnerable to overlaying. Ambivalence. The crowd is neither good nor bad. It connects and distorts at the same time. It is a psychological phenomenon that must be understood. Return to one's own voice. The conscious restoration of the inner contour, not resistance against the crowd, but a rediscovery of one's own standpoint. Distancing. The inner step back that makes the dynamic visible without leaving it. Reorientation. The rediscovery of one's own line, one's own values, one's own perception. Personal responsibility. The recognition that one's own voice carries weight, even when the collective mood demands something else. Integration. The bringing together of outer and inner perspectives. The crowd is not only an external phenomenon, but an internal state, and the return to one's own voice is part of this dynamic. These terms form the map of this episode. They show how the crowd emerges, how it acts, and how the individual can remain within it, not through separation, but through awareness, contour, and inner clarity. Closing remarks. This episode has brought together the outer and inner dynamics of the crowd. It has shown how the crowd emerges, how it acts, and how the individual can remain within it. The next episode continues this exploration with a new focus, a new inner scene, and a new perspective on the psychological architecture of the collective. Thank you for taking this space. Perhaps something from this episode accompanies you through the day, the week, or simply this moment. You decide what you carry with you and what you leave behind. We will meet again in the next episode. Calm, clear, and with an open gaze toward what moves us inwardly. Note for independent reading. If you feel the desire to explore the original text more deeply, you can also read The Crowd, a study of the popular mind by Gustave. For this series, I work with a public domain German translation by Rudolf Eisler from 1908, alongside the original edition. Publication note. The script of this episode will soon be available as a digital edition for purchase. If there is positive resonance and sufficient interest, the complete special series, Psychology of the Crowd, Original Edition, will be published as a book-on-demand release. This publication will include a revised, consistently structured version of all the episodes as well as additional materials. Support note. This channel is created in my free time, by me alone, with care, research, and attention to detail. If you would like to support my work or listen to my content on other platforms, you will soon find me on Spotify. Every form of support, a subscription, sharing the content, or a small contribution helps me continue producing these formats. Disclaimer. This format is not a therapeutic offering. The content of the series serves literary psychological reflection and critical engagement in social and historical concepts. It does not replace psychological, medical, or therapeutic advice and is not intended as guidance for self-diagnosis or self-treatment. All described phenomena, terms, and inner scenes are analytical and literary representations, not individual recommendations. For personal or health-related concerns, it is strongly advised to consult qualified professionals. The author assumes no liability for decisions or actions taken based on the content of this series. This script is a work of Kulturerbe Archivarin. All texts, meditations, and imagination exercises are protected by the copyright. Use is permitted for private purposes only.